All right. So last time we talked about how the relationship between parent and child sort of innately creates this development of the inauthentic false self within the child that goes on to associate the expression of one's own authentic values with a sort of instinctual death threat. And that throughout the child's development and later on in life, this significantly contributes to the inability for the person to discover who they truly are, discover what they genuinely value, and act for the sake of it in the world. And we talked about how, of course, this is a huge stumbling block in the journey towards personal authenticity. Just in this attempt to explain what has gone wrong. If we want a world in which everybody can act for the sake of what they genuinely value simultaneously and universally, then this conflict that exists internally for the child that comes about as inherently in the parent-child relationship represents a big stumbling block. And of course, later on, we'll talk about, or in a different video, we'll talk about ways of overcoming this, ways of overcoming the pressures of survival, the psychological pressures of the parent-child relationship that bleed into adulthood and whatnot. But we have still yet to cover everything. We have still yet to cover the significant contributors to inauthenticity in the world and therefore meaning and therefore a good life, a life which is desirable. And the next thing we have to talk about that sort of gets in the way of this entire process is the state. And I want to get into a little bit about how I understand that word state because it's distinct from the word government. And the distinction between a state and between a government is going to be important later on when we're talking about how the structure of the state actually impacts inauthenticity. In the way that I understand it and use it, a the term government just refers to any sort of um, governing body, any group of people that creates rules and regulations and organizations and hierarchies that help organize the behavior and the decisions of a group of people. And governments can be voluntary or involuntary. An example of a voluntary government would be something like a church body. One becomes a member of the church and so voluntarily submits themselves to the church hierarchy and voluntarily submits themselves to the rules that are set up by that church organization. Businesses, at least actually at least voluntarily based businesses, also operate in the same way. One works or participates in a business or maybe even a nonprofit, and that business typically has some sort of organizing structure, some sort of hierarchy, some sort of rules of behavior, expectations, dress codes, policies, whatever have you, right? And it is again a governing body, but it is voluntary in the sense that one can come and go as they please, and or so long as the governing body wishes them to be there, right? They can sort of come and go as they please. And one's membership, you could say, it is dependent on whether one follows the rules. So they sign up for the rules, and if they break the rules, then they get kicked out. This would be a voluntary organization. But then you have involuntary or force-based governing structures. And these are what I would call the state. But and so um, something like the United States would be an example of a state. And it is considered a state because it's involuntary. People are sort of born into it and they don't sign up to the rules of the organization, but they are still subject to the rules of the governing body, regardless of whether they voluntarily enter into that agreement or not. Another example you could use of a state would be sort of like a mafia or a gang, which uh, let's say it informally rules over some sort of town or city, right? And the people who are born into that city or the people who lived there before the mafia came, when that mafia comes in and uses force and violence to establish itself and its rules as the way in which that community lives, that it would be considered a state in this definition. It would be a very small and less powerful state compared to something like the United States government, but it would still be considered a state under this definition. Not only that, but when I'm talking about state, I'm not simply talking about the organization in and of itself. So I'm not simply talking about Congress and the president and the different bodies that make up the state. I'm not simply talking about I don't know the Don and the captains and the capos and the soldiers in these different kinds of organizations, but I'm also talking about the kinds of organizations that the presence of the state um, creates and perpetuates by its existence. So in the mafia example, there might be certain businesses that the mafia props up for one reason or another in the community because they benefit the mafia organization. Whereas those businesses that mafia wasn't there, they might have folded or they might have not done as well, or they might have existed in a different form or changed owners. While the mafia is there, those businesses exist because the mafia keeps them in place. And I don't really make a distinction in this definition between the businesses that exist because of the mafia and the mafia itself. And in a similar way, when we're talking about something like the United States government, when I talk about the state, I'm not simply talking about the actual organizing body. I'm also talking about things like corporations, which exist as an extension of the laws created or the rules created by the original governing body. And the businesses and the institutions that exist, like much of academia, much of corporate business, um, certain kinds of industries, for example, weapons manufacturing. These all exist in this definition as an extension of the state because they only exist because of the state's use of violence or use of force within the country as a whole, you could say. And both a government, a voluntary government, and a state may use force as a part of their laws, you might say. But again, the distinguishment is whether or not I sort of voluntarily participate in the organization or not. Do I voluntarily join the church and submit to its rules and therefore submit to its use of force in the circumstances in which I violate those rules? Or am I forced to participate in an organization that uses force against me when I break their rules to which I've never agreed to in the first place? And that distinction matters because one can authentically submit oneself to a set of rules which involves force and not violate one's authenticity because one is still voluntarily acting for the sake of that manifestation of structure, organization, whatever. And one believes that there is a sort of benefit to following those rules and is, again, voluntarily willing to submit to force in the case of the violation of those rules. Whereas when one is forced to participate in a governing structure, it is inauthentic from the get go. It's inauthentic from the get go because one doesn't voluntarily choose, one does not actually actively act for the sake of participating in this organization and following its rules. One doesn't actually value the rules or value the organization because one has been forced into it. So that would be the first distinction between government and state. I'm not necessarily anti government. I'm not anti hierarchy. I'm not anti rules. I'm not anti structure. I'm not even anti uh, punishment for rules. But I am anti force in a categorical way. If one voluntarily submits to a structure, that is not considered force when consequences were a part of that voluntary participation. But when consequences are forced on one by forcing the structure on one, that is a violation of the principle of authenticity that I'm working with here. So I'm not anti-rules, anti-hierarchy, anti-government, but I am anti-state. And the distinction, again, is really um, between a voluntary participation and an involuntary participation. And there are two things, so transitioning to talking about the state, there are two things about the state that prevent authenticity. The major one, or the main factor, is the use of force or the threat of force in and of itself, on the one hand. And on the other hand, is the culture which forms around the presence of that force as a result, and socially and psychologically, and in terms of economic incentive, reinforces the acceptance, participation in, and perpetuation of the state. The example that to me that often comes to mind is the one that Foucault used when he was talking about the panopticon, where, and he was talking about architecture in this example, but he was talking about how the structure of the building, the fact that, you had a tower in the middle of this prison that was formed in this circular way. The tower, having only one guard, was able to keep in control all of the prisoners within this building simply because of the perception problem. The fact that the one guard could look into each and every single cell around them was able to reinforce the fear that encouraged the inmates to sort of self-regulate and perpetuate their own imprisonment. And Foucault uses this as an example and maybe even an analogy for how culture works. That the structures that we live in, the structures that have been established around us, and the culture that's been established around us often incentivizes us to self-regulate and to self-enslave and to perpetuate the state of something that we don't authentically desire because of the fear of repercussion, even if the actual presence of physical force is not there. And it's always been an interesting example because, I personally, I got a lot out of reading about this, because it explains a lot of why, when physical violence is not directly present, people still self-regulate, and even build into themselves confirming beliefs as to why the current state or the current order is legitimate. But at the same time, I think Foucault overplays his hands because I think he relies too heavily on the cultural reinforcement as being the primary reason as to why the prisoners stay. And this is where I would sort of disagree with his analysis of something like that. And the reason I would disagree is, or the reason why the cultural structures which reinforce the acceptance of the state, to me, are not the primary obstacle, but actually the use of physical, or the use or the threat of physical force is the actual issue. The reason why I would consider that to be primary is because even in the example of the panopticon here, if we were to remove the threat of physical force entirely, or if the prisoners were convinced that no physical force would be used against them, then no amount of architectural design, no amount of self-perpetuating belief would ultimately prevent the prisoners from leaving. Even if many of them, even if they stayed around for a long time because they continued to have this belief in the fear of the state, or sorry, the fear of being perceived, and if they at some point somebody is going to take a risk and no punishment is going to come. At some point, somebody's going to perceive doing something wrong or trying to leave, and no physical force is going to come. And then once that one person or a few people start doing that, it shows everybody else that there's not an actual threat there. There was only the illusion of threat. So it's not that the culture of violence is what actually perpetuates the structure. It is the real threat of physical force that is made efficient by a culture of perceived threat, right? The state has become incredibly efficient at reducing how much time and energy and resources have to go in perpetuating their own legitimacy, to the point where the vast majority of people in the United States believe that they live within a government that is truly free and truly chosen, in which the government rules by consent of the people, and that in all essence the state is voluntary. And they've done this through a variety of cultural mechanisms that are all perpetuated, or that are ultimately reinforced by the actual threat of violence underneath the state, the actual threat of force. Now, how does this relate to authenticity? Well, it's pretty clear in the sense that to the degree to which there is force being used against you, you cannot act for the sake of what you truly value. In fact, the presence of force is the very opposite of authenticity. It means that you are being forced to act for the sake of things that you don't value. Because if you value them, you would simply act for the sake of them voluntarily. I mean, if you value them in an ultimate sense, in a way that actually meant you were moving towards what you desired, you wouldn't need somebody to use force against you to go there, right? Like if you want to go get groceries, nobody has to point a gun at your head in order for you to go, because you authentically want the food, right? So you get up and go voluntarily. Nobody has to point a gun at your head if that's what you truly want. Whenever force is used against you, it means you are necessarily acting against what you value, or you're being forced to choose between two things that you don't value, like we used in the robbery example, where the presence of the gun and the threat of the use of force forces you to choose between two inauthentic values, uh, or forces you to choose between two values, which you don't naturally have to choose between, right? So you're either your life or the wallet. What you really want is your life and the wallet, but now you have to choose between two. And so now you've been forced into an inauthentic choice. Um, and that's sort of the mechanism of how the threat of force ultimately ends up in the same thing as the actual use of physical force. Now, the state doesn't operate primarily on the direct use of force. It operates on the threat of force principally. And that's sort of where it wants to get to. That's what the state would like to get to, because the actual use of physical force is incredibly costly. If every single time somebody broke a law, a regulation, or a dictate by the state had to actually send a person out to use direct physical violence against somebody to get them to comply, the state wouldn't be able to continue to operate because it would simply be too costly, too many resources. There's not enough people to actually directly regulate the entire population of the United States, for example. So the state to operate does not rely on direct physical violence very much. It relies on the threat of violence in the case of breaking a law, a regulation, or a dictate against the from the citizen or from the state against the citizen. The state just has to make sure that it actually follows through on those rare situations in which a citizen defies the law regardless of the threat, which it does with, again, significant enough efficiency to keep everybody else afraid of breaking the rules. And I know what a lot of you are thinking at this point. At least I think I know what you're thinking at this point. Which you're thinking, he has not established why it is that a state like the United States is not voluntary. And most of you, I assume, would think, well, we live in a democracy. We live in a representative democracy where we get a vote, we get a choice, and therefore the laws reflect in some way the desires of the people under which it rules. And quite frankly, I'm not going to get into whether or not the state, I'm not getting into the counter arguments as to why the state is actually voluntary and not involuntary. We're going to deal with that in another section. We're going to deal with that when we come to the critiques of what I'm talking about. And we're also going to deal with that. We're going to deal with a lot of the other critiques that come with this entire system, like why is authenticity an ultimate value? Can a murderer be authentic in his murdering? Is there not actual value that comes out of the parent-child relationship? There are a lot of objections that are a part of, or that naturally come in response to the things that I'm talking about here. And I don't want to pretend that the things that I'm saying, especially the controversial things that I'm saying, are just a given. It's mostly I don't want to deal with them in this video as much as deal with them when we get to the video talking about objections to what I've been talking to up to this point. So I am sort of beginning with the assumption, you could say, and deliberately beginning with the assumption that that something like the United States is an involuntary government in the sense that we don't choose to be a part of the system, and we don't choose to be a part of its rules, and we don't choose to be a part of the democratic process. We don't choose the structure of the state that we're born into. Rather, the entire structure is forced on us. And you can go through that or make the best you can make the best devil's advocacy that for that case that you want to, but we're not going to get into the objections right now. We're starting with the assumption that the state is an involuntary government organization. And again, because of the nature of the fact that it is involuntary, means that every single law that it passes, every single dictate that it passes, carries with it the threat of violence, carries with it essentially the mantra, quite literally, comply or die. And I know that might sound extreme, but if we just even try to work it out here, we can see why something like that mantra would make sense. Because take something like as simple as taxation. The state dictates that if you work a certain amount and you make a certain amount of money, then there's a certain percentage of that income which the state is entitled to and is going to take from you. And you don't have a choice as to whether or not the state actually takes that amount of money away from you. You are forced to give that money to them. You can try to evade them by, working, for instance, I could work a job, or I could try to work a job which has no direct taxation. Most jobs, you have to fill out all this paperwork so that the government can tax you directly, so that it's much more difficult for you to evade being taxed by them. Let's say I work a construction job and I only get paid cash and I make $100,000 a year from this, right? So long as I can hide this from the state, I'm not going to be, my money's not going to be taken from me. But of course, much of the state infrastructure exists to find out people who are trying to avoid their laws. And so, how does this go about, right? Is it that you just refuse to pay one single dollar and then the state just comes up to you and kills you? No, that's not how it works. But there is a progression of compliance or the escalation of violence. So the state finds out you haven't been paying taxes on your construction job or your construction business. And, they're going to send you a nice little letter in the mail that says, hey, you owe this much taxes plus interest plus whatever. Or maybe even you have to show yourself in court because you have a trial to see whether or not we're going to give you jail time for not paying taxes, right? You get this nice little letter in the mail. And at that point with the letter, you have a choice. You can either comply with what the letter is telling you and say, okay, I'm going to go pay these taxes, or okay, I'm going to go show up to court, let them sentence me and comply with having them lead me off to jail and whatnot, right? Or you can say, no, I'm not going to comply with this, right? And then we brings it to another level. If for some reason the state doesn't catch up with you at that point, then you get away with it, right? Because the state has failed to really enforce its dictates, right? But what usually happens is if you ignore a letter like that is eventually you'll get a nice knock at your door from a police officer, or maybe you'll be driving off to your construction job and there'll be a warrant for your arrest. And the police officer will knock on your door and tell you, you've ignored this letter, you haven't shown up to your court date. Now I'm here to escort you to your court appointment date, right? And then you have a choice in that moment. You can say, I'm going to comply with what this officer is telling me, this representative of the state. I'm going to comply with what he tells me. You go along with him, court date, et cetera, et cetera. You probably have extra fines or extra jail time because you failed to show up when the letter summoned you, right? Or you can try to resist the officer, right? You can say, I'm not going to come with you. And one of two things are going to happen, right? You are either going to effectively resist him, in which case you get away, right? Or he is going to force you to comply and drag you physically off, right? He is essentially going to escalate the amount of violence that he uses against you until you are forced to comply with what he is asking you, right? And if you escalate the resistance to this, he is going to escalate his violence. So as you escalate, he'll escalate. And eventually, if you escalate effectively enough, if you resist effectively enough, then he will use lethal force against you. He will kill you. The degree to which you resist what he is telling you to do, you resist compliance, is the degree to which he'll escalate force against you until he outright kills you. And this for something as small as not paying taxes. And so underneath every single law is this principle. You either comply with the law or we're going to kill you. You either comply or you die. That's the essential principle of it. Now, it doesn't always work out in that way because there are a lot of steps in between. But the essence, the end of the law is always comply or die. It might just escalate to severe bodily harm. It might just escalate to, severe disability. It might just escalate to being, knocked out unconscious. It might escalate to being tased and then dragged off. But these are all forms of compliance. They're forced forms of compliance, but they're all forms of compliance. But this is the principle of law. It doesn't matter what the law is, to the degree that it is enforceable, or to the degree that the state cares about enforcing it, the principle and the end of the law is always the same: comply or die. There is always, no matter what law it is, so long as the state cares about enforcing it, there is always the threat of death underneath every single enforcement of law. And this makes sense. This is practical from the state's perspective. Why? Because if there wasn't the threat of physical harm or death against you, then you wouldn't comply. The state wouldn't be able to follow through on enforcement. Nobody would pay their taxes if the state couldn't force you to pay your taxes or force you to comply with its punishments or else kill you. So this entire setup is designed to incentivize you in a number of ways to follow along with the law, even though you have no voluntary desire, because underneath it all is the threat of death. But we don't experience this on a day-to-day basis, right? Like going back to the taxation example, the state kind of just takes the money out of your wallet, and most people, generation after generation, just they pay their taxes. They tell their kids it's important to pay the taxes. We come up with all kinds of excuses, like it funds all these kinds of things, and it actually really benefits us. But at the end of the day, it's just the people within the state saying, "Give me this money, or I'm going to harm you." Um, and so we create sort of these ideological justifications for it, and the day-to-day basis looks peaceful because the government is not required to use physical violence in order to get people to do it. They just have to threaten people or have the subtlety of threat be present within the enforcement of any law to actually incentivize people to comply with it, whatever it is they're talking about, or whatever it is they want you to do. And again, many of you are going to say, "Oh, this is justified because of X, Y, and Z." And we'll get into all that in a later video. I'm just sort of talking about the dynamics here. I'm not even necessarily morally critiquing it. I mean, I'm connecting it to inauthenticity because it is directly connected with inauthenticity in a structural way. But I'm not necessarily giving it moral critique here. But of course, it does interfere with inauthenticity or authenticity. And the reason it interferes with authenticity is, again, pretty direct. The degree to which the state uses force against me and threatens me is the degree to which now I must shape myself and my behavior, my desires, what I'm acting for, what my career is going to be, my ability to survive, and essentially my entire life, depending on how pervasive the presence of the state is. I have to direct myself and conform myself um, around what the state demands from me. And from state to state, there are differences in what the state demands, but the same principle applies. I can't simply act for the sake of what I value. I have to act for the sake of what I value in conformity to whatever the state demands from me. And so naturally, this produces categorical inauthenticity in oneself. It prevents one from acting for the sake of what one genuinely values, and instead funnels it all through a state-approved category or system. And I think in the last video, I talked about how there is a connection between the parent-child relationship and the state-citizen relationship. And in fact, I think in some ways, the parent-child relationship actually prepares us for the state-citizen relationship. And this is part of the reason as to why people accept that relationship so readily. And to break it down very simply, the parent is an authority in the child's life, not because the child has chosen them or finds innate value in them, but because the parent has power over life and death. They have a huge amount of power over the child, and the child's not only their life, but their capacity to survive in the future, and their capacity to learn and understand, their capacity to achieve values in the future is hugely dependent on their parents and whether the parents help them, teach them, and keep them alive. And the child knows this at an instinctual level. and so becomes what it has to become, ignores its own authentic interest to a large degree, and becomes whatever it has to become in order to satisfy whatever dictates, whatever culture, whatever values, whatever ideas the parent has and wants the child to conform to. The child has to conform themselves to the parents, and then loses touch with their own authentic nature to a large degree, and then struggles with connecting back to that authentic nature in the future, which leads to meaninglessness and depression and pain and suffering and many other kinds of things. The relationship between the citizen and the state is pretty darn similar. Um, the individual, because of the modern context of the state, depends heavily on the state for all kinds of things. The state has made itself the state has made us dependent on it. It's a little bit different from the parent-child relationship because the child is just quite literally dependent on the parent in a very sort of natural way. But it's unnatural when it comes to the state because the state has made us dependent on it, and it's made us dependent on it by monopolizing through the use of violence all different kinds of areas of the state, right? So the state has a massive influence on the economy in general through interest rates and subsidies and economic regulations and picking winners and losers and the kind of economic structure that it promotes and protects. It's made us completely dependent on the state for our own personal safety through both the police state and the military. It's not like we have a choice in our security. We don't get to sort of choose whether or not the state provides police for us or whether or not the state provides the military for us. They just do that, and they push out any other sort of, I guess you could say, competition when it comes to security needs. They have massive control nowadays over retirement, over healthcare, over education, over agriculture, and just day-to-day living in general. The power of the state is present everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere you look, the state has its hands in our day-to-day lives. And again, some of you might say this is great, some of you might say it's not, but the point is to say that the individual depends on the state in an enormous capacity, and not because that is natural, but because the state has used its monopoly of violence to create that dependence. It has systematically pushed out competition from the police, from the military, from utilities, from economic domains, from banking, from agriculture. It's systematically pushed out uh, competing structures in these various domains through its use of force, making us dependent on the state for these things. Because now, without state violence, society would just fall apart. I mean, if we didn't have the police, there would be chaos, right? But not because the state is necessary to maintain order, but because the state has crowded out any alternative structures for something like day-to-day security. Agriculture we would all starve to death without the state, not because the state is necessary for agriculture, but because the state has crowded out all competition around alternatives for agricultural production. And it's done this with across a myriad of domains. And so now the citizen is dependent on the state. And this is where I think a lot of defense of the state comes in, where we think we are dependent, we are sort of naturally dependent on the state for all these good things. And we say we need the state to provide us all this kind of stuff. Because if we didn't, then it would be, we would be useless. We wouldn't have all this kind of stuff. But it's kind of similar to this is an example I've heard before. It's not unique to me, but it's kind of similar to somebody saying, if there was only one grocery store, if we were all forced to shop at one grocery store, right? And we couldn't compare that grocery store to anything else because we had no other options, and there had never ever been any other options. And somebody came along and said, we should really we should really get rid of this grocery store, right? Everybody around them would go, well, what do you mean? Without this grocery store, we would all starve to death. But that's because there's no other options to choose from. And it's sort of the same thing with the state. Uh, Within the state, and because of the state's influence in so many domains, without the state, society would collapse. But that's not because the state is necessary for society, but that because the state has made itself necessary for society. Um, And so going back to the whole authenticity thing, this radically limits what I'm actually allowed to sort of do with my life. Because again, everything has to be channeled through not simply what the state demands from me, but all of the monopolies and the monopolistic powers that the state has imposed on my life. And of course, you get all these other bad actors as well. I mean, you get these people that come in and um, they commandeer the power of the state for their own interests, and then even if you believe that somehow the state is the representative of the people, all of these oligarchs and uh, and special interest groups ultimately gain control over the power of the state and push it towards their own interests. And now I have to act for the sake of somebody else's values instead of mine. It's kind of like how older generations have used the state to secure the housing market and make it beneficial for themselves when they were younger. And now that same generation is trying to protect their own financial assets through using the power of the state to prevent building new housing, and through zoning laws and through interest rates and all this other kind of junk. And politicians are incentivized to protect the housing market for people who have put their entire retirement into the value of their house. And now that's creating a problem for new generations who, they want to be able to buy new houses, but older generations that are more populist have commandeered the power of the state for their own interests. And now the rest of us are prevented from acting for the sake of what we actually value because, older generations have commandeered the power of the state. And some of you are going to say, well, the real power is not the state; it's the capitalists or it's the capital class, and there's a lot of legitimate criticism there. But we'll get into the economic side of this, some other time because that's a whole other issue. And also it's kind of getting close to where I want to end this recording today. But getting back to the relationship between the parent and the child and the state and the citizen, there is that psychological dependency. The child must change and conform themselves sort of intuitively to become what it needs to become in order to satisfy the arbitrary values imposed by the parents. And in the same way, the citizen has to conform themselves more explicitly with more wisdom, but they still have to conform and change who they are and what they actually want out of life, and even in the very direction of their life, in order to appease whatever the arbitrary rules or values that are being pushed by the state are. And even if you're a person who lives in the United States and thinks, well, the values that my government is representing are actually good, then just take a look at all the states that you don't agree with, someone like China or Russia or anywhere else, and you can see more objectively the same power dynamic happening in a state that you're not directly dependent on, and that'll help you give yourself more objectivity into how the state really controls people's destinies in a very fundamental way that often goes hidden because there is no direct violence. But the state drastically hinders the authenticity of the individual and really sets their life on a course which is, of course, not chosen. And so, connecting the bridge here, even if you're a person who has become aware of the inauthenticity that's produced out of the parent-child relationship, you wake up to that, you dig yourself out of that, right? You come to an understanding of who you are. You start to become more self-knowledgeable. You start to be able to act more in line with what you truly value rather than what you were forced to become as a child. what you wake up to is just another layer of problem. And in the other layer of problem is now you have a state and a culture which reinforces that state, which blocks your ability to actually act for the sake of what you value. There is a direct threat to your freedom to be able to even act on what you authentically value in the first place. It has to now be in conformance with the broader culture that exists to defend the state and the violence and the threat of the state itself. And that can kind of just ruin an entire person's life in some ways, or it can drastically reduce the quality of a person's life because now they are not, all these options for authenticity are sort of artificially cut off from for them, uh, for their ability to actually act on for the sake of what they value. So it adds this extra layer to uh, inauthenticity and makes authenticity an even greater challenge than it was beforehand. You have to deal with the internal psychological issue. Well, now you have to deal with three things, really, right? You have to deal with just the existential limits and survival limits that come with, that are a natural barrier to one's authentic values. Then you have to deal with the intrinsic power relationships that created inauthentic self image. But then, even if you overcome that, now you have to deal with the state and the violence of the state and what it forces you to conform to, in order to act for the sake of. And again, the parent child relationship actually prepares you for the state citizen relationship. And so there's a furtherance of the same inauthentic dynamic throughout one's entire life. And, with all of this force and violence being used against us, we wonder why, even in the West, we're so unhappy. But anyway, I wanted to lay out that sort of dynamic, that extra layer that gets in the way of authenticity, which is the state. Um, Talk a little bit about the cultural dynamics, though there's more to be said there. And I really think that brings us to the end of the major things that get into the way: the false self-image that's created in the parent-child relationship, survival, and the existential limits that are placed sort of naturally on one's ability to be authentic, and the state and cultural elements that get in the way of authenticity as an adult. And again, just for emphasis here, underneath all three of these layers, the existential limits, existential and natural limits, the parent-child relationship, which creates the false self-image, and the state-citizen relationship, which causes both cultural and physical and violence-based limitations on the expression of authenticity. Underneath what unifies all three of these elements is force. These are all different variations of force with different moral culpabilities and different different causal extents of underlying force, but they are all examples of the same kind of force. And so you can see this tension between force on the one hand, or this really a fundamental antagonism between force on the one hand and authenticity on the other hand, that sort of unifies the question of what's gone wrong. And these are the three major elements. There are other elements that are significantly involved in here, but they're not as major as these three. And I just really wanted to lay out the major ones, right? So in the next episode, what we're going to talk about is how do we overcome this, right? And it'll probably also be 3 episodes explaining how do we overcome it. Like, how do we overcome the existential limits? How do we overcome the parent-child inauthentic dynamics? And how do we overcome the state-citizen dynamics? And then lastly, we're going to talk about, again, does this hold up to scrutiny? And that's the episode where I'm going to talk more about common objections, right? Because there are some very common and natural objections that come up to this almost from the get-go, that we're going to talk about deeper in the last episode. And that'll be the summation of this sort of first pass at the philosophy. But again, if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. I hope that today's episode was a little bit more clear than the other ones have been. I've been aiming to try to be better and trying to practice this over each episode. And I just hope that that progress of articulation is coming across. If you like what you hear, please, like this video and subscribe, and we'll talk to you later.